You are a podcaster. The words cut through the Rayburn House office building hearing room like a blade, sharp and rehearsed, weighted with the authority of 3.5 decades in Congress. Maxine Waters sat forward in her chair, her index finger extended toward the witness table, her voice rising with the particular intensity that had made her both celebrated and feared across Capitol Hill for 35 years. A podcaster who earned his position by pledging loyalty to Donald Trump. You have no right to occupy that seat. You are not FBI. You have never been FBI. You are a media figure playing costume in a government institution. And every citizen watching this proceeding should be alarmed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the nation's premier law enforcement agency, has a radio host serving as its deputy director. The gallery reacted. Cameras clicked in rapid succession. On the dais, Republican members of the Judiciary Committee shared the rehearsed expressions of politicians recognizing a moment destined for viral circulation. Democratic members signaled agreement with Waters, some visibly. The hearing room vibrated with the distinct energy that accompanies a Maxine Waters display, because that's precisely what it was, and everyone understood this. And she remained unconcerned because the display was the objective. Dan Bongino occupied the witness table. He registered no reaction. He remained motionless in his chair. He didn't reach for his water or adjust his microphone or glance toward his legal counsel for direction. He sat the way a law enforcement officer sits when a suspect screams during interrogation, motionless, attentive, cataloging every statement for subsequent use. He waited until she completed her remarks. He allowed the silence to settle for 2 complete seconds, sufficient time for the cameras to capture the contrast between her intensity and his composure. Then he opened a folder. "Congresswoman Waters," he said, and his voice carried the flat, measured cadence of Queens, New York, the voice of someone who had served 4 years as an NYPD officer and 12 years as a Secret Service agent, and had discovered that the individual who speaks most quietly in a room of shouting becomes the one everyone hears. "I appreciate your passion. I'd like to read something into the record if the chairman permits." The chairman signaled approval. Federal Election Commission filing. Committee named citizens for Waters. Between 2003 and 2023, your campaign disbursed a total of $1,213,000 to an entity called Progressive Connections. The payment category listed on every filing is Slate mailer management fees. Progressive Connections is a fictitious business name registered to your daughter, Corinne Waters. He raised his eyes from the folder. $1.2 million from your donors to your daughter, over 20 years for pamphlets. The hearing room transformed, not in the theatrical manner of television courtrooms. No gasps, no murmurs, no gavels strike. It transformed the way a room transforms when someone activates a light in a shadowed corner and everyone observes what's been present all along. A shift in attention, a realignment of focus. The cameras that had been directed at Waters during her accusation pivoted to Bongino and remained fixed there. Waters opened her mouth. No words emerged. It marked the first occasion in 35 years of public existence, 35 years of labeling presidents racist, of demanding impeachments, of instructing cabinet members they weren't welcome in public establishments, that Maxine Waters possessed nothing to articulate. The silence endured 3 seconds. In politics, 3 seconds of silence from Maxine Waters constitutes an event of seismic significance. To comprehend how it occurred, how the woman who had constructed an empire on righteous indignation found herself silenced by a man reciting her own financial disclosures, you must return 4 hours to the morning when Maxine Waters still believed she was the prosecutor and Dan Bongino was the defendant. She arrived at the Rayburn building at 7:45, which was early by her standards. Waters was not a morning individual. She was a performance individual, and performances require preparation. Hair, wardrobe, the selection of the appropriate eyewear that communicates I am serious but also stylish. The review of talking points she would not actually utilize because Maxine Waters had never in her existence needed talking points. She possessed instinct. She possessed volume. She possessed 35 years of never being challenged by anyone who mattered. Her chief of staff, a meticulous man named Tuan Samuel, had prepared a briefing document. It contained Bongino's public statements, his podcast excerpts, his 3 unsuccessful congressional campaigns, and a summary of his appointment as FBI Deputy Director by Kash Patel. The document was organized around a singular theme. Bongino is a podcaster who possesses no business running the FBI. Emphasize the credentials, Samuel instructed forcefully and repeatedly. Podcaster, talk show host, not FBI. The media will amplify it. By this afternoon, every news ticker in the country will state Waters confronts unqualified FBI Deputy Director. That's the victory. Waters examined the document without reading it. She didn't need to. She'd been executing this since before Tuan Samuel was born. She understood how congressional hearings functioned. You select a line of attack. You deliver it with maximum volume. The cameras capture the moment and the news cycle completes the rest. The substance didn't matter. The clip mattered. He's a podcaster, she said. End of discussion. What Waters didn't know, because she hadn't examined the briefing document carefully enough, and because her staff hadn't researched Bongino's career beyond the podcast, and because 35 years of never being challenged had rendered her incurious about the people she attacked, was that Dan Bongino had been a police officer in one of the most violent neighborhoods in America before she'd ever heard his name. She didn't know about the 75th Precinct in East New York, Brooklyn. She didn't know about the Financial Fraud Task Force. She didn't know about the Department of Justice Award. She didn't know he'd protected Barack Obama. And she especially didn't know that a man who had spent years investigating financial fraud for the United States Secret Service, who had built cases against people who conceal money in shell companies and route payments through family businesses, was the worst possible opponent for a congresswoman whose daughter had been collecting campaign money for 2 decades. 3 miles away in a secure office at FBI headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue, Bongino sat with his general counsel, a career DOJ attorney named Marcus Webb, and 2 analysts who had spent the previous week constructing what Bongino called, in the direct language of a Queen's cop, the receipt folder. She's going to label you a podcaster, Webb said. That's her only strategy. She doesn't know your background. Her staff thinks you're a television personality who received a political appointment. Excellent, Bongino said. Let her. What's your plan when she attacks your credentials? Precinct 75, Financial Fraud Task Force, Presidential Protection Division, Obama. I present it all directly. No theatrics. Like I'm reading a resume at a job interview. The contrast performs the work. She's shouting. I'm stating facts. And then Bongino opened a laptop. On the screen was a spreadsheet. 20 years of Federal Election Commission filings organized chronologically. Citizens for Waters, Progressive Connections, Karen Waters, dollar amounts highlighted in yellow, each one verified against public FEC records. Then I read her the receipts. Webb studied the spreadsheet. 1.2 million over 20 years for pamphlets. Bongino said slate mailers. She's the only federal politician in America who uses them, the only one. And the person running the operation is her daughter. Her donors, people in South Central Inglewood, Compton, some of the poorest zip codes in California, give her money to fight for them and she sends it to her kid. He closed the laptop. She's built a 35-year brand as the voice of the poor. I'm going to demonstrate that she's been using the poor as a business model. Not with opinions, not with insults, with FEC filings, public records, numbers that anyone with an internet connection can verify. Webb nodded slowly. She'll play the race card. She always does. And when she does, I'll remind her that I started my career in East New York, 98% minority, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country, and that I protected Barack Obama with my life. Let her explain how a man who served a black neighborhood and guarded a black president is a racist. She'll say you're attacking a black woman who's fought for her community. And I'll say I'm reading FEC filings. That's it. FEC filings. If reading public records is an attack, then the Federal Election Commission is the real enemy. He paused. Then, in the voice of a cop who has witnessed too much to be surprised by anything but who still, despite everything, becomes angry at those who prey on the vulnerable, she lives in Hancock Park. $5 million house, 6,000 square feet. Her district has a 27% poverty rate. She doesn't even live in the district. She lives in a mansion next to the old J. Paul Getty estate, and she calls herself a warrior for the poor. I walked a beat in East New York. I lived near the people I served. I know what poverty looks like because I saw it every morning and every night. Not from a mansion in Hancock Park, from the street. He stood up and paced, the restless movement of a man who spent years on his feet on a beat in formation. Not a desk politician, a street cop who happened to end up behind a desk. Here's what people don't understand about financial fraud. When a CEO steals from a pension fund, when a banker fabricates loan documents, the victims are always the same people. The people who can least afford to lose. Working people, retirees, small investors, the poor. The fraud doesn't happen in mansions. It lands in neighborhoods like East New York, in districts like the 43rd. And when I examine Waters' record, not her speeches, not her social media posts, her actual financial record, I see a pattern I've seen 100 times as a financial fraud investigator. Money comes in from small donors who believe in a cause. Money goes out to family members through entities that provide questionable value. The operation is technically legal, and the people who funded it never know where their money went. That's not corruption in the criminal sense. I'm not saying she committed a crime. I'm saying it's a betrayal, and the people she betrayed are the ones she claims to fight for. Webb looked at the file one more time. What about the SBF angle? Bongino pulled up a screenshot. Waters' tweet from December 2nd, 2022. We appreciate that you've been candid in your discussions about what happened at FTX. Below it, a photograph of Waters and Sam Bankman-Fried at a conference in the Bahamas, arms around each other, both smiling broadly. She was the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, the committee with oversight over crypto exchanges. SBF and his executives gave $300,000 to 9 members of her committee. He gave $40 million to Democrats. And when his platform collapsed and $8 billion disappeared, she thanked him for being honest. 7 months later, convicted on 7 federal counts, 25 years. She was supposed to be the watchdog. She was the lapdog. The hearing began at 10 o'clock. Chairman Jim Jordan called the room to order and read the standard opening. The committee would hear testimony from FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino regarding ongoing reforms at the Bureau under Director Kash Patel. The first 90 minutes were routine. Republican members asked about the pipe bomb investigation, the restructuring of field offices, and the new emphasis on violent crime. Democratic members asked about political targeting, the departure of career agents, and the demand for names of agents involved in January 6th investigations. Bongino answered each question in the same flat, precise tone, the tone of a man giving a briefing, not performing for cameras. Then Chairman Jordan recognized Maxine Waters for 5 minutes. Waters was not a member of the Judiciary Committee, but Jordan had agreed, with the particular generosity of a chairman who knows the opposition is about to make a mistake, to allow her to question the witness as a courtesy. Waters adjusted her glasses. She did not look at notes. She did not need to. Mr. Bongino, she began, and the Mr. was deliberate, a refusal to use his title, a small act of disrespect designed to establish the power dynamic from the first syllable. You are not an FBI agent. You have never been an FBI agent. The position of deputy director has been held by career FBI agents for 117 years. You broke that tradition not because you earned it, not because you had the qualifications, but because you were a loyal supporter of Donald Trump on your podcast, and he rewarded you. Is that an accurate summary of how you got this job? Bongino leaned toward his microphone. No, Congresswoman, it's not. Would you like me to tell you how I actually got here? I didn't ask for your life story, I asked. I'll keep it brief. He didn't wait for permission. In 1995, I was 19 years old. I entered the NYPD Police Cadet Program at the City University of New York. In 1997, I became a full-time police officer. I was assigned to the 75th Precinct in East New York, Brooklyn. He paused. Not for drama. Bongino didn't do drama. For emphasis. For those who don't know the 75th Precinct, it covered one of the highest crime neighborhoods in the United States. In the late 90s, East New York had a murder rate that made the national news. I patrolled those streets. I responded to domestic violence calls at 2 in the morning. I knew the families. I knew the kids. I knew who was selling and who was buying and who was getting hurt. In 1999, I joined the United States Secret Service as a special agent. I was assigned to the New York field office and then to the Financial Fraud Task Force, where I investigated white-collar criminals, people who steal money through sophisticated schemes and route it through shell companies and family businesses. I received a Department of Justice award for the successful investigation and prosecution of financial fraud. He turned a page in his folder, though he wasn't reading from it. He was letting the camera see the gesture. In 2006, I joined the Presidential Protective Division. I was assigned to protect the President of the United States. I served on the detail for President George W. Bush, and then I stayed on and served on the detail for President Barack Obama. 2 presidents, 2 parties. Both trusted me with their lives. After that, I transferred to the Baltimore field office, where I served as the lead agent on a multi-million-dollar fraud investigation that resulted in successful federal prosecutions. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from the City University of New York and a master's degree from Penn State University. I've been in law enforcement for 13 years. He looked directly at Waters. So, with respect, Congresswoman, I'm not a podcaster who got a badge. I'm a law enforcement officer who had a podcast. I gave up a show that reached 20 million people a month to take a government salary. What podcaster does that? The hearing room recalibrated. Waters' staff, watching from a row behind the dais, sensed the shift, the almost imperceptible change in the room's attention that occurs when a witness stops being a target and starts being a threat. Samuel texted Waters' press secretary. He came prepared. She needs to pivot. Waters didn't pivot. She had spent 35 years not pivoting. Pivoting was for politicians who were afraid. Maxine Waters was not afraid. Mr. Bongino, your resume doesn't change the fact that you and Kash Patel are weaponizing the FBI for Donald Trump's personal. Congresswoman, since you've raised the subject of weaponizing public trust for personal benefit, I'd like to enter something into the record. The phrase public trust for personal benefit landed like a door opening onto a room Waters didn't want anyone to see. She heard it. The gallery heard it. The cameras heard it. Bongino opened his folder. Federal Election Commission filings. Committee Citizens for Waters. Payee Progressive Connections, a company registered to your daughter Corinne Waters. Payments. Slate mailer management fees. Total between 2003 and 2023. $1,213,000. He read the numbers the way a cop reads a booking sheet, flat, clinical, letting the facts do the work. In the 2020 election cycle alone, your campaign paid your daughter $250,000. In the 2022 cycle, $192,300. In 2021, not even an election year, $74,000. Congresswoman, slate mailing is an uncommon practice in federal elections. In fact, during the 2020 general election, you were reportedly the only federal politician in the entire United States running a slate mailer operation. The only one. And the person managing it was your daughter. He set down the folder. Your campaign donors, many of them from one of the poorest congressional districts in California, gave you money to fight for them. Your campaign gave over $1 million of that money to your daughter for pamphlets. Now, I wouldn't normally bring this up in a hearing about FBI operations, but you've accused me of abusing public trust. So let me ask, when Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, not a Republican organization, not a conservative think tank, a liberal watchdog group, named you one of the most corrupt members of Congress 4 times in 2005, 2006, 2009, and 2011, was that weaponization too? Waters' hand hit the desk. This is a distraction. This is an attack on a black woman who has fought for her community for 35 years. You come in here with your Congresswoman, I'm not attacking anyone. I'm reading FEC filings. These are public records. Anyone in this room can look them up on the Federal Election Commission's website tonight. Your donors gave you money. Your campaign gave $1.2 million of that money to your daughter. Those are facts. If you'd like to explain why your daughter was the only person in America running a slate mailer operation for a federal campaign, I'm genuinely interested in the answer. Waters did not provide the answer. She stared at Bongino with the look of a woman who has been in 1,000 fights but has never in any of them been hit with her own financial disclosures. Bongino continued. The tone didn't change. It never changed. That was the weapon. The monotone, the flatness, the cop voice that treats $1 million revelation the same way it treats a parking ticket. No theatrics, no raised voice, just receipts. And since we're discussing the relationship between your public service and your family's finances, Congresswoman, let me add one more item. In September 2008, you arranged a meeting between Treasury Department officials and executives of One United Bank. Your husband, Sidney Williams, was a former member of the bank's board of directors and a stockholder. The bank had invested heavily in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and was on the verge of collapse. One United received $12 million in TARP bailout funds, $12 million in taxpayer money. And if the bank had not received that money, I'm quoting the Ethics Committee's own report, your husband's investment would have been worthless. The House Ethics Committee charged you with 3 violations of the Code of Official Conduct. 3. You told the committee you had recused yourself, but your Chief of Staff, Michael Moore, your grandson, continued to advocate for One United on your behalf. The committee cleared you. Your grandson received a letter of reproval instead. He paused, just long enough. Congresswoman, I investigated financial fraud for the United States Secret Service. I built cases against people who use intermediaries to avoid accountability. The pattern is always the same. The principal claims they didn't know. The subordinate takes the blame and the money stays in the family. I'm not questioning the committee's decision. I'm inviting the American people to draw their own conclusions. Waters erupted. I was cleared unanimously, 10-0. The committee found I did nothing wrong. You were cleared because your grandson said he acted without your knowledge while working in your office, under your supervision, for a bank your husband owned stock in. And the grandson was the one who received the reproval, not you. You walked away clean and the 24-year-old staffer who happened to be your grandson took the hit. That's not justice, Congresswoman. That's a family business. The phrase hung in the air. Family business. It connected the dots. The daughter collecting $1.2 million in campaign money. The husband's bank getting $12 million in bailout funds. The grandson absorbing the ethics violation. 3 family members, 3 revenue streams, all flowing through the same elected official. Bongino shifted slightly, the way a boxer shifts his weight before the combination that ends the fight. Congresswoman, you've built your career as a voice for the poor. Your district, California's 43rd, includes parts of South Central Los Angeles, Inglewood, Gardena, Compton. The poverty rate in parts of your district is 27%, double the national average. These are communities where families live on $30,000 a year, where kids go to schools that haven't been renovated since the 90s, where the streets your constituents walk every day look nothing like the street you live on, because you don't live in your district. You live in Hancock Park, a 6,000-square-foot mansion valued at nearly $5 million. Your neighbors include the former estate of oil magnate J. Paul Getty. Your home sits outside the boundaries of the 43rd Congressional District. I started my career in East New York, Brooklyn, Precinct 75. The people there lived in walk-ups and housing projects. I didn't commute in from a mansion to police their neighborhood. I was there every shift, every call. I saw poverty the way your constituents see it, up close, every day, with no gate between me and it. So when you call yourself a warrior for the poor, Congresswoman, when you've collected $1.2 million for your daughter from your campaign, when your husband's bank got $12 million in taxpayer bailout money, when you live in a mansion outside the district you claim to represent, the people in South Central and Inglewood and Compton might reasonably ask, who exactly are you fighting for? And Congresswoman, since we're discussing South Central, in 1992, when the Rodney King verdict came down, your district erupted. 63 people died. Over 2,000 were injured. 12,000 were arrested. Reginald Denny was pulled from his truck and beaten nearly to death with a cinder block on a street in the district you represent. You led a chant of no justice, no peace. You called it a rebellion, not a riot. You said it was understandable. That was 33 years ago. The poverty rate in your district hasn't meaningfully changed since then. South Central still bears the scars. And somewhere between 1992 and today, you moved to a $5 million mansion in Hancock Park, a few miles and an entire world away from the people whose rebellion you championed. Waters had been building toward an explosion for 3 minutes. It arrived now. This man, this administration is destroying democracy. They are locking up journalists. They are weaponizing every agency in this government. They are targeting black leaders. And you sit there in a chair that doesn't belong to you, reading opposition research about my family while this country burns. Bongino waited. He had learned in the NYPD that when someone is shouting, the worst thing you can do is shout back. You wait. You let the shouting echo off the walls, and then you speak quietly because quiet after shouting is the loudest sound in the world. Congresswoman, you've raised the subject of threats to democracy. I'd like to discuss your own record on that topic. He opened to a tabbed section of his folder. June 23, 2018, Los Angeles. You made the following statement, and I'm quoting from video. If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, a Democrat congresswoman, not a Republican, responded the following day. Quote, "No one should call for the harassment of political opponents. That's not right. That's not American. Your own party's leader in the Senate said what you did was un-American. Not my words, his." He turned a page. April 17, 2021, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. The Derek Chauvin trial was days from verdict. Tensions were at a breaking point. George Floyd's family was waiting for justice, and you traveled to Minnesota and told a crowd of protesters, quote, "We've got to stay on the street and we've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business." The judge presiding over the Chauvin trial, Judge Peter Cahill, made the following statement from the bench. "I wish elected officials would stop talking about this case, especially in a manner that is disrespectful to the rule of law and to the judicial branch." He called the behavior by elected officials abhorrent, and he told the defense, and I quote, "Congresswoman Waters may have given you something on appeal that may result in this whole trial being overturned." Bongino set down the folder. George Floyd's family wanted justice. A jury was deliberating, and a sitting member of Congress flew to Minnesota and told a crowd to get more confrontational. A statement so inflammatory that the presiding judge said it could have resulted in the entire trial being thrown out. Not because you cared about justice, because you wanted a camera moment. The Republican minority moved to censure you. Democrats voted it down, 216 to 210, along party lines. Not because your comments were acceptable, even the judge called them abhorrent, but because your party couldn't afford the political cost. Waters was breathing hard. Her hands were flat on the desk. Her staff, watching from behind the dais, had stopped texting. Bongino spoke one more time. The voice hadn't changed, hadn't risen, hadn't wavered. "And one more thing, Congresswoman, since you've spent this hearing lecturing me about corruption and abuse of power. In November 2022, Sam Bankman-Fried presided over the collapse of FTX. $8 billion in customer funds vanished. Pensioners, small investors, working families, people who trusted a platform that FTX's celebrity endorsements told them was safe, gone. You were the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, the committee with direct oversight over exactly this kind of fraud. And here is what you said on Twitter on December 2, 2022, 3 weeks after $8 billion disappeared. We appreciate that you've been candid in your discussions about what happened at FTX. Candid. The man who stole $8 billion was candid. You thanked him. Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX executives donated over $40 million to Democratic candidates and groups during the 2022 cycle. $300,000 went directly to 9 members of the House Financial Services Committee. Your committee. There are photographs of you and Bankman-Fried at an FTX conference in the Bahamas, arms around each other, smiling. 7 months after you called him candid, He was convicted on 7 federal charges, including wire fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. He's serving 25 years in federal prison. You called a man who stole $8 billion candid. And then you came to this hearing and called me a threat to justice. Congresswoman, I investigated financial criminals for the United States Secret Service. I know what fraud looks like. I know how it operates. I know the pattern, the scheme, the cover, the enablers who look the other way because the money is flowing in the right direction. And I know what it looks like when the people who are supposed to hold criminals accountable are too compromised to do their jobs. The hearing room was still, the kind of still that happens when a large number of people simultaneously realize they are witnessing something that will be discussed for a long time. Chairman Jordan sat with his hands folded, making no move to intervene. Democratic members stared at various points on the wall or the ceiling, the gaze of politicians who are calculating the distance between themselves and the blast radius. Bongino looked at Waters one last time. Let me summarize the record, Congresswoman, since you asked about my qualifications to sit in this chair. Between 2003 and 2023, your campaign paid your daughter $1.2 million for pamphlets. Your husband's bank received $12 million in taxpayer bailout funds after you arranged a meeting with Treasury. You were charged with 3 ethics violations. Your grandson took the reproval. A liberal watchdog group named you one of the most corrupt members of Congress 4 separate times. You live in a $5 million mansion outside the district you represent, a district where the poverty rate is 27%. You told Americans to harass cabinet members in restaurants. Your own party leader called it un-American. You told protesters to get more confrontational during a murder trial. The judge called your behavior abhorrent and said you nearly caused a mistrial. And you called a man who stole $8 billion candid 3 weeks after the money disappeared, and 7 months before he was convicted on 7 counts of federal fraud. I started my career walking a beat in East New York, Brooklyn, Precinct 75. The people there didn't live in mansions. They didn't have daughters collecting million-dollar campaign contracts. They didn't get bailouts when their investments went bad. They were the people you claim to represent from a $5 million house in Hancock Park. You've spent 35 years building a brand as a champion of the poor, but the poor in your district are still poor. The poverty rate is still 27%. The schools are still failing. The streets are still dangerous. And the only people who have gotten rich from Maxine Waters' career in public service are Maxine Waters and her family. I don't need to be lectured about justice by someone who thanked a man who stole $8 billion. I don't need to be lectured about qualifications by someone whose greatest financial achievement is funneling $1 million to her daughter for pamphlets. And I don't need to be lectured about democracy by someone whose own party leader said her rhetoric was not American. I protected 2 presidents. I investigated financial fraud. I walked the beat in one of the poorest neighborhoods in this country. I know what service looks like. And what you've done for 35 years, Congresswoman, isn't service. It's a business. Silence. Chairman Jordan let it hold for 4 seconds. Then, the gentlewoman's time has expired. Waters was already standing. How dare you? I have fought for 35 years. The gavel came down. The gentlewoman's time has expired. She stood at the dais for another moment, her hand gripping the edge of the desk, her mouth open around a sentence that wouldn't come. Then she gathered her papers, though she hadn't looked at them once, and walked out of the hearing room. Her staff followed. She did not stop for reporters. She did not stop for cameras. She turned left down the hallway and disappeared into the marble corridor. For 8 minutes, no member of the Congressional Black Caucus posted anything on social media. In an institution where political communication is measured in seconds, 8 minutes of silence is an event without precedent. The clip traveled the way all congressional hearing clips travel in the modern age, not as a single piece of footage but as a series of fragments, each one optimized for a different audience and a different platform. The first fragment was the FEC filing reading, 37 seconds, Bongino's flat voice reading the numbers, 1,213,000, Progressive Connections, Karen Waters, pamphlets. It hit 15 million views by dinner time. Someone on X overlaid the numbers on a split screen with images of South Central Los Angeles. Boarded storefronts, potholed streets, a homeless encampment 3 blocks from a school. The split screen went viral independently of the original clip. The second fragment was the credentials reversal. 24 seconds. I walked a beat in East New York, Precinct 75. The people there didn't live in mansions. Someone found Bongino's old NYPD precinct photo from 1998. A kid in a blue uniform with a crew cut standing outside the 75th Precinct Station House on Sutter Avenue. The photo was shared alongside a satellite image of Waters's Hancock Park mansion. No commentary needed. The third was the SBF moment. 19 seconds. You called a man who stole $8 billion candid. Someone dug up Waters's original tweet and placed it next to Bankman-Fried's mugshot and his 25-year sentence. The juxtaposition was devastating. Candid became a hashtag. The fourth, the one that did the most damage, was the closing. The full summary, every item in sequence. Daughter, 1.2 million. Husband's bank, 12 million. Ethics violations, 3. Crew, most corrupt 4 times. Mansion, 5 million outside the district. Get more confrontational. Judge said abhorrent. SBF candid, then convicted. 2 minutes and 14 seconds. It was shared 41 million times in 48 hours. Waters held a press conference 3 hours after the hearing. She stood in the Rayburn Building hallway, flanked by 5 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and delivered a statement that had been revised 4 times in the interim. What you witnessed today, she said, was a racist attack on a black woman who has spent 35 years fighting for her community. Dan Bongino is a political operative installed by Donald Trump to weaponize the FBI against black leaders and progressive voices. His performance today was not oversight. It was character assassination. And I will not be silenced. The statement was factually precise in the way that political statements often are when the underlying facts are indefensible. It addressed the characterization of the attack without addressing the content. Waters called it racist. She called it weaponized. She called it character assassination. But she didn't address the 1.2 million. She didn't address One United. She didn't address the mansion. She didn't address Candid. And by the time the press conference aired, 30 million people had already watched Bongino read the FEC filings, which meant that 30 million people noticed what she didn't say. The racist attack narrative encountered an immediate structural problem. Bongino had started his career in East New York, a neighborhood that was 98% black and Hispanic, and had protected Barack Obama. He hadn't mentioned race once during the hearing. He had mentioned FEC filings, ethics committee reports, Judge Cahill's statements, and Chuck Schumer's quote. Every source he cited was either a government document or a Democrat. The race card, which had protected Waters for 35 years, didn't work against a man who had served a black neighborhood, guarded a black president, and quoted a Democratic Senate leader. The most unexpected reaction came from Waters's own constituents, not from political operatives or media figures, but from the people who lived in the 43rd Congressional District, the people whose donations had funded the payments to Karen Waters. A woman who ran a laundromat in Inglewood posted a video that was viewed 9 million times. She was standing in her shop, still wearing her work apron, and she spoke directly to the camera. I've donated to Maxine Waters 3 times, $50 each time. I thought it was going to help the community, literacy programs, job training, something. You're telling me my $50 went to her daughter for pamphlets. 1.2 million for pamphlets. I press shirts for $8 an hour. Do you know how many shirts that is? A retired teacher from Compton wrote a letter to the Los Angeles Times that was published 3 days later. I've lived in this district for 41 years. The poverty rate when Maxine Waters took office was high. It's still high. The schools were struggling then. They're struggling now. She's been our representative for 35 years, and the only thing that's changed is the value of her house, which isn't even in our district. I'm not angry at the FBI man. I'm angry at myself for not asking these questions sooner. A pastor from South Central, a man who had endorsed Waters in every election since 1996, gave an interview to a local news station and said something that was shorter and more devastating than anything said in the hearing room. 1.2 million is 24,000 textbooks. It's 600 scholarships for kids in our community. It went a pamphlets for her daughter. I need to pray on that. The math became its own viral moment. 24,000 textbooks, 600 scholarships, 1,200 laptops. That's what $1.2 million buys in a community with a 27% poverty rate. The contrast between the number and the purpose, pamphlets versus textbooks, Karen Waters versus the children of the 43rd District, was the kind of simple arithmetic that no amount of political spin could obscure. Crew, the liberal watchdog group that had named Waters one of the most corrupt members of Congress 4 times, issued a statement confirming their prior reports. Our findings from 2005 through 2011 regarding Representative Waters's financial relationships with family members through campaign and official activities remain part of the public record. The pattern documented in those reports is consistent with the FEC filings cited during today's hearing. The FTX Candid clip became a case study in a different kind of failure. Waters had called Bankman-Fried candid on December 2, 2022, 3 weeks after $8 billion in customer funds disappeared. She had done so publicly on Twitter as the chair of the committee responsible for financial oversight. When someone assembled a timeline, November 11th, FTX collapse, $8 billion gone. December 2nd, Waters calls SBF candid. December 12th, SBF arrested in Bahamas. March 2024, SBF convicted on 7 counts. November 2024, SBF sentenced to 25 years. The timeline told a story that required no commentary. The person responsible for oversight thanked the person responsible for the crime. The deeper damage wasn't about any single dollar amount or any single statement. It was about the gap between the brand and the record. For 35 years, Maxine Waters had occupied a specific space in American politics. The fearless black congresswoman who speaks truth to power, who calls out racism, who fights for the poor, who demands accountability from the powerful. Anti-Maxine, the icon, the warrior. But icons survive on mythology, and mythology survives on the absence of scrutiny. What Bongino had done with FEC filings, not opinions, with government reports, not accusations, with the words of a Democratic Senate leader and a presiding judge, not partisan talking points, was subject the mythology to arithmetic, and the arithmetic didn't work. A warrior for the poor whose daughter collected $1.2 million from her campaign. A champion of accountability whose grandson absorbed her ethics violation. A voice of justice who thanked a man who stole $8 billion. A representative of the people who lives in a $5 million mansion outside the district she represents. A critic of incitement who told crowds to get more confrontational, earning a rebuke from a judge who called her behavior abhorrent. A defender of norms whose own party leader called her rhetoric not American. Bongino didn't call her a criminal. He didn't call her corrupt. He didn't call her a racist, which would have been absurd, and he knew it. He called her something more precise and more damaging, something that connected all the dots, the daughter, the husband, the grandson, the mansion, the donors, the poverty rate, into a single devastating image. He called her a poverty pimp. Not in those words. He was too disciplined for that. But the picture he painted, a woman who built a career on the suffering of the poor while her family extracted millions from the system her career was supposed to reform, was the picture that word describes. And once the picture was assembled, once the FEC filings and the Ethics Committee reports and the property records and the judge's rebuke and the SBF timeline were laid out in sequence, the picture couldn't be unassembled. Bongino returned to FBI headquarters after the hearing. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't post on social media. He went back to work. There were cases to review, operations to coordinate, the day-to-day business of being the second highest-ranking official in the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country, business that doesn't trend on social media, because it's the kind of boring, essential, unglamorous work that doesn't generate clips. When Webb asked him how he thought it went, Bongino said, "I read receipts, that's it. I didn't write the FEC filings. I didn't write the Ethics Committee report. I didn't write Judge Cahill's statement. She wrote her own record over 35 years. I just read it back to her in front of 40 million people. The people in her district deserve to hear it. They've been paying for it. In the weeks that followed, Waters did what she had always done. She gave interviews. She posted on social media. She called the hearing a racist ambush and compared it to the attacks on every black leader who dares to speak truth. The machine still worked. The donations still came. The base still rallied. MSNBC still booked her. CNN still quoted her. But something had shifted. The same kind of shift that follows all of these moments. Not a collapse, but a crack. Not an earthquake, but a settling of the foundation that changes how the structure bears weight. The crack was in the pause. The moment of hesitation when a donor considers writing a check and remembers the 1.2 million. The moment when an ally considers a joint press conference and remembers Candid. The moment when a constituent hears I'm fighting for you and thinks your daughter got $1 million and my kid's school doesn't have air conditioning. She walked into the hearing room as Auntie Maxine, the icon, the warrior, the voice of the voiceless. She walked out as a line item in her own financial disclosures, read aloud by a cop from East New York who had learned in the streets and in the Secret Service and in the FBI that the most powerful weapon in law enforcement isn't a badge or a gun or a shouted accusation. It's a receipt. And in the 43rd Congressional District of California, in the laundromats and the barbershops and the schools without air conditioning and the streets that still haven't been repaved since the rebellion of 1992, people who had never thought to look up FEC filings were now looking. They were typing Citizens for Waters into the Federal Election Commission website. They were finding the payments. Progressive Connections, Karen Waters, Slate mailer management fees, $8,000 here, $16,000 there. $250,000 in a single cycle. They did the math. They compared it to what they donated. $50, $100. Money they'd given because they believed it would help their community. Money that had ended up, dollar by documented dollar, in the bank account of their representative's daughter. Bongino had said it plainly. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm reading FEC filings. But FEC filings, it turned out, were the most devastating attack of all because they couldn't be denied. They couldn't be spun. They couldn't be called racist or partisan or weaponized. They were numbers filed by Waters' own campaign, available to anyone with an internet connection. And the numbers told a story that 35 years of speeches and slogans and righteous fury couldn't rewrite. The story of a woman who spoke for the poor and spent for the family, the people's money, the family's business, and a cop from East New York who read the difference out loud. The hearing lasted 97 minutes. The clip that went viral was 2 minutes and 14 seconds. But the impact, the real impact, wasn't measured in time or views or shares. It was measured in the question that millions of people in Waters' district and across the country were now asking themselves. If 1.2 million went to her daughter for pamphlets, where did the rest of it go? That question, once asked, doesn't go away. It sits in the back of the mind during every future speech, every future interview, every future campaign. It's there when Waters stands at a podium and talks about fighting for the people. It's there when she rails against corruption and demands accountability. It's there when she presents herself as the voice of the voiceless. Because Bongino didn't just expose payments to Karen Waters. He didn't just reveal the One United bailout or the SBF praise or the mansion in Hancock Park. He exposed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Waters' 35-year career. The woman who built her reputation fighting the system had become the system. The woman who claimed to speak for the powerless had used that power to enrich her family. The woman who demanded transparency from everyone else had hidden in plain sight behind FEC filings that no one bothered to read until a former financial fraud investigator read them into a congressional record. And that's what made the moment so devastating. It wasn't an allegation. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It wasn't opposition research from a partisan think tank. It was her own records, publicly filed, legally documented, available to anyone who cared to look. The defense she might have offered that the payments were legal, that Progressive Connections provided legitimate services, that Slate mailers are a valid campaign tool, all of that might have been technically true, but it missed the point. The point wasn't whether it was legal. The point was what it said about who she was fighting for. When a woman representing one of the poorest districts in California pays her daughter over $1 million for campaign materials while her constituents struggle to afford textbooks for their children, the legality is irrelevant. The optics are everything, and the optics were brutal. A mansion in Hancock Park, a daughter collecting seven-figure sums, a husband's bank rescued with taxpayer money, a grandson taking the fall for an ethics violation, a close relationship with a man who stole $8 billion, a judge calling her behavior abhorrent, her own party leader calling her rhetoric un-American, and through it all, a poverty rate in her district that never moved, schools that never improved, streets that never got safer. 35 years in Congress, and the only measurable change in the 43rd District was the net worth of the Waters family. That was the story Bongino told, not with rhetoric, not with accusations, but with numbers. 1.2 million, 12 million, 5 million, 27%. Numbers that couldn't be argued with, couldn't be spun away, couldn't be dismissed as racism or weaponization or character assassination. Numbers that told their own story. In the days after the hearing, political analysts tried to contextualize what had happened. Some called it a masterclass in opposition research. Others called it a political assassination. Still others called it a necessary accountability moment. But the most accurate description came from a former prosecutor who had worked with Bongino in the Secret Service and watched the hearing from his home in Virginia. He didn't attack her, the former prosecutor said in an interview. He audited her. And there's no defense against an audit when the numbers don't add up. That was it. An audit. Not a political attack, not a racist tirade, not a weaponization of government power. An audit. A systematic review of publicly available financial records that revealed a pattern of family enrichment inconsistent with the stated mission of fighting for the poor. Audits don't care about intentions. They don't care about rhetoric. They don't care about 35 years of speeches or chants or hashtags or viral moments. They care about one thing. Do the numbers add up? And in Maxine Waters' case, when a former financial fraud investigator sat down with her FEC filings, her ethics committee reports, her property records, and her public statements, the numbers didn't add up. 1.2 million to a daughter for pamphlets in a district where the poverty rate is 27% doesn't add up. 12 million in bailout funds to a husband's bank doesn't add up. Living in a $5 million mansion outside the district you represent doesn't add up. Calling a man who stole $8 billion candid doesn't add up. Telling protesters to get more confrontational during a murder trial doesn't add up. Being named one of the most corrupt members of Congress 4 times by a liberal watchdog group doesn't add up. Individually, each item might be explained, contextualized, defended. But taken together, they formed a pattern. And the pattern told a story that contradicted everything Waters had spent 35 years building her career on. The warrior for the poor lived like the rich. The champion of accountability avoided accountability. The voice of the voiceless enriched her own voice. The fighter for the people fought for her family. That's what the audit revealed. And once revealed, it couldn't be unrevealed. Waters's defenders tried. They pointed out that the payments to Progressive Connections were legal. They noted that she had been cleared by the Ethics Committee in the One United matter. They argued that slate mailers are a legitimate campaign tool. They emphasized that she had never been convicted of any crime, all of which was true, but none of which addressed the fundamental question that voters in her district were now asking. If you're fighting for us, why is your family getting rich? That question, simple and devastating, cut through every defense, every explanation, every contextualization. Because at the end of the day, politics isn't about legality. It's about trust. And trust is built on the belief that your representative is fighting for you, not for themselves. When a representative pays their daughter over $1 million in campaign funds, when their husband's bank gets a $12 million bailout, when they live in a mansion outside the district, when they praise a man who stole billions, the trust breaks. Not because any individual action is illegal, but because the cumulative effect creates the impression that the representative is serving their own interests, not the interests of their constituents. And impressions in politics are reality. The impression created by Bongino's recitation of Waters's financial record was clear. A woman who had spent 35 years building a brand as a champion of the poor had spent that same 35 years enriching her family at the expense of the poor she claimed to champion. That impression, once formed, is almost impossible to shake. It doesn't matter how many speeches Waters gives. It doesn't matter how many times she appears on MSNBC. It doesn't matter how loud she shouts or how passionate she becomes. The numbers are there, publicly filed, permanently recorded, and they tell a different story than the one she's been telling for 35 years. The story of a family business masquerading as public service. The story of personal enrichment disguised as political activism. The story of a poverty pimp who discovered that the best way to profit from poverty isn't to solve it, but to perpetuate it, to build a career on the suffering of the poor, while ensuring that the poor remain poor, dependent, and loyal. Bongino didn't say those words. He didn't need to. The FEC filing said them for him. $1.2 million to Karen Waters, $12 million to Sidney Williams's bank, $5 million mansion, 27% poverty rate unchanged in 35 years. The numbers spoke for themselves. And in the 43rd Congressional District, in the communities Waters had represented for over 3 decades, people were listening. They were listening in a way they hadn't before. Not to her speeches, not to her tweets, not to her appearances on cable news. They were listening to the silence. The silence where an explanation should have been. The silence where a defense of the $1.2 million should have been. The silence where a justification for the mansion and the bailout and the candid tweet should have been. But there was no explanation. There was no defense. There was no justification. There was only deflection, racism, weaponization, character assassination. Words designed to change the subject, to shift the focus, to make the conversation about Bongino's motives instead of Waters's money. But it didn't work, not this time, because Bongino hadn't offered an opinion, he hadn't made an accusation, he hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply read from public documents, FEC filings, Ethics Committee reports, Judge Cahill's statement, Chuck Schumer's quote, all matters of public record, all verifiable by anyone with an internet connection. You can't call public records racist. You can't call FEC filings weaponization. You can't call a direct quote from a Democratic Senate leader character assassination. And when you make that argument, you reveal something more damaging than any allegation could reveal. You reveal that you have no defense, that the numbers are real, that the pattern is real, that the family enrichment is real, and that the only response you have is to attack the person who pointed it out. That revelation, that moment when a politician with 35 years of experience stands in front of cameras and offers nothing but deflection in response to documented evidence of family enrichment, is the moment when the brand collapses. Not immediately, not dramatically, but definitively. The collapse happens slowly, one donor at a time, one constituent at a time, one moment of hesitation at a time. The next time Waters asks for a donation, the donor hesitates. The next time she speaks at a rally, the crowd is smaller. The next time she demands accountability from someone else, the hypocrisy is too obvious to ignore. That's the real damage, not the viral clips, not the social media pylon, not even the immediate political fallout. The real damage is the erosion of trust. The slow, steady, irreversible erosion of the belief that Maxine Waters is fighting for anyone other than Maxine Waters. And once that trust is gone, it doesn't come back. Not with more speeches, not with more outrage, not with more attacks on political opponents, because the trust wasn't built on speeches or outrage or attacks. It was built on the belief that a representative from a poor district would use their power to help that district, not to enrich their family. Bongino understood this. He understood that the most effective attack isn't an attack at all. It's an audit, a cold, clinical recitation of facts that forces the audience to draw their own conclusions. He didn't need to call Waters corrupt. He just needed to read her financial records and let the numbers speak. He didn't need to accuse her of betraying her constituents. He just needed to point out that her daughter collected over $1 million, while her district's poverty rate stayed at 27%. He didn't need to argue that she was a hypocrite. He just needed to quote her praise for Sam Bankman-Fried and note that he's now serving 25 years for stealing $8 billion. The conclusions drew themselves, and that's what made the moment so devastating. It wasn't Bongino's opinion that damaged Waters. It was her own record. It wasn't his accusations that undermined her credibility. It was her own financial disclosures. It wasn't his rhetoric that exposed her hypocrisy. It was her own tweets and statements and public positions. All Bongino did was compile them, organize them, and read them aloud in a congressional hearing room in front of 40 million people. The rest, the viral clips, the constituent outrage, the erosion of trust, the collapse of the brand, all of that happened because the numbers didn't lie. 1.2 million, 12 million, 5 million, 27%. Numbers that told a story. The story of Maxine Waters, not the story she told about herself. The story her own records told. The story of a woman who claimed to fight for the poor while living like the rich. The story of a representative who claimed to serve her constituents while enriching her family. The story of a politician who spent 35 years building a brand on righteous indignation, while building a fortune on the backs of the people she claimed to represent. That story, once told, can't be untold. And Maxine Waters, who walked into that hearing room as Auntie Maxine, the fearless icon, the warrior for justice, walked out as a cautionary tale. A reminder that in politics, as in law enforcement, the most dangerous enemy isn't the one who shouts the loudest. It's the one who keeps the receipts. And Dan Bongino, the cop from East New York, the financial fraud investigator, the man who protected 2 presidents and walked the beat in one of the poorest neighborhoods in America, had kept every single receipt. And when the moment came, when Maxine Waters made the mistake of attacking his credentials, of questioning his right to sit in that chair, he opened his folder and read them all.